great horn was blown and a cheer went up from the gathered Arthurians. Horses whinnied and neighed, sharing in the excitement of their masters. Dowras had remained atop the boulder which now stood alone in the middle of the wide gap. The hot wind was blowing in from the desert, billowing his silver cloak behind him. He looked out over the numberless sand dunes and thought about the long weary miles that lay between his people and the sundering sea. 500 miles as the crow flies, he reminded himself. Dowras couldn't help but chuckle at the phrase, remembering his tribal roots. He was a member of the tribe of crows after all, one of only a few hundred who had remained loyal to Draco Rex after his fall. The rest of his people were traitors, siding with the great deceiver after his victory. His kindred was waiting for him and the other faithful tribes to return, dreading the day of the reunion. Dowras smiled as he envisioned the event in his mind. He pictured his traitorous kinsfolk fleeing in terror before him and his men. He imagined them begging for forgiveness and for pardon from Princess Lisa as they groveled at her feet. But first we must cross over the desert before that happens, thought the captain of the Einherjar Guard. He turned, jumped down off the raised rock, mounted his horse and rode up to Lisa. By your command, my sovereign, we await only your word, he cried, raising his voice to be heard above the din. The command is given, Lisa replied with a wave of her hand. Lead your men, captain. Dowras bowed his helmed head and held his right hand over his heart. When he straightened, he wheeled his horse about and took his position in front of his men. He surveyed them for a moment, taking pride in their discipline and eagerness. They would serve him and their princess with all their heart. Soldiers of the Einherjar, Dowras roared, drawing out his sword as he spoke. The blade rang as it was drawn from the scabbard and it shined brightly in the sunlight as he held it high over his head. Forward, march. The ranks upon ranks of heavily armed and armored men crashed their long steel-tipped spears against their metal shields. They began marching into the desert, their polished helms, hauberks, spearheads and shields glittering in the sunlight. Regimental standards and company banners were unfurled and flown proudly before the men. Horns and trumpets were sounded while officers and sergeants barked their commands to the lower ranks. Suddenly drums began to beat and all the Einherjar began chanting to the even rhythm. Long we have waited here in this dreadful place. In this waterless and aired wasteland. We have stood on guard while our people rest. We have guarded them from all outer harm. Now we march forth. Now we march forth. We march forth to our true homeland. Arthuria, Arthuria, we return to you. Long have we been sundered from our rightful place. No more will we suffer exile in this place. We go, 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 we go to our rightful realm and home. We go to our true blessed home. Arthuria, Arthuria, we return to you. As the Einherjar made their way out of the sanctuary, they were closely followed by the tribal chieftains and the personal housecarls. Zelinda was first. With a whooping cry he spurred his horse and galloped away. He quickly closed the distance between himself and the royal guard and leapt over them, showing off his horsemanship. Maya whinnied as she sailed over the helmed heads of the Einherjar. Both horse and rider landed safely on the other side of the men, who were both amazed and amused by the stunt and kept going. Show off, bellowed Carla, his booming voice echoing off the towering stone cliffs. Zelinda reined in his steed and wheeled about. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted back, saying, "Think you can do better?" Carla laughed and grinned wickedly at Zelinda. The giant man spurred his shire horse to a gallop and thundered towards the rear ranks of Einherjar. The soldiers could not help but hear him coming. His deep voice boomed with laughter while his huge horse whinnied and snorted. "Look out!" cried one man. "Get out of his way!" called another. "Big bear incoming!" howled a third. "He'll smash into us!" shouted a fourth. "Scatter!" yelled an officer when he saw Carla bearing down on them. The tightly packed ranks of men dove aside just as the chieftain of the tribe of bears reached them. The man spurred his horse once again, causing the animal to leap into the air. Magni did indeed manage to leap off the ground, but the giant horse wasn't able to jump as high or as far as Maya. It was fortunate that the soldiers had dashed out of his way when they did. The Einherjar would have doubtlessly been bowled over like a game of 9 pins. Carla and Magni landed with a heavy thud and trotted up to Zelinda, who was laughing in bemusement. "Better luck next time," smiled Zelinda. "Bah," growled Carla, "you only won because Magni and I didn't warm up first." "Whatever you say, big brother," chuckled Zelinda. Several Einherjar shouted angrily at Carla, shaking their mailed fists at him. Dowras thundered up to them, sliding to a halt. Would you two stop using my troops as jumping posts? He growled crossly, they're making sure that that way is safe and they can't do that with you two fools leaping over them as if they were fallen logs. Oh, what's the matter, Captain? Lost your sense of humor? Laughed Zelinda. Dowras was about to answer when suddenly a jovial cry was heard. He looked over just in time to see Ling Tra and his horse, a coal-black stallion named Carador, leaping over the ranks of footmen. Soon afterwards Emmett did the same. The captain of the Einherjar looked at the new arrivals and shook his head. Why do I even bother with you lot? He asked himself as Ling Tra and Emmett rode up. Well? Asked Ling Tra. Well what? Asked Carla. Which of us jumped better? Emmett asked. I'd say it was a tie, answered Zelinda. And I say that's the last time you four will be using my men as jumping posts. Growled Dowras, we are trying to ensure that the way is safe for our people and my men can't do that if you keep jumping your horses over them. It was only a bit of fun, grunted Carla. I'll show you fun the next time you nearly plow into me, shouted one of the Einherjar. I don't care how fun it is. Stop doing it, Dowras commanded. Very well, Captain, we'll stop, said Zelinda, but I'm not too sure about them. Zelinda pointed past the Einherjar towards the gap in the wall. Dowras looked and his face fell when he saw the mounted companies of each chieftain's housecarls galloping full speed towards them. The riders whooped and laughed while the horses whinnied. The Einherjar saw them coming and felt the sand trembling under their boots as the horsemen drew nearer. They growled and cursed under their breath. There were too many to dodge and they couldn't get out of the way in time before they were upon them. The footmen were forced to do the only thing that they could at that moment. They knelt down and let the riders leap over them. The mounted housecarls laughed and hooted as they sailed over the royal guards. Once they landed on the other side of the ranks, they knew better than to stick around. The horsemen thundered off into the desert, beyond the harsh rebukes from the Einherjar that were sure to follow. The chieftains laughed as they watched their mounted men go. Dowras growled in annoyance, shaking his helmed head. Oh, what's the use of it? He moaned aloud. Oh, lighten up, Captain, said Zelinda, you should be as happy as the rest of us. We're going home, Dowras. Home, added Ling Tra. We're not home yet, my lords, snapped the captain, or have you forgotten that there are at least 10,000 nomadic tribes out there in the sands? And need I remind you that almost all of them loathe us with every fiber of their beings? We'll be lucky if we run into only half of them on our way to the coast. It is more likely that all of them will be hounding us the second word gets out about our exodus, said Zelinda. Good, boomed Carla, my axe has been getting rather dull lately. I could use a good dust-up to sharpen my skills. Only you, Carla, would see 10,000 hostile tribes arrayed against us is a good thing, Emmett laughed. In any event, I think we'll all be getting in some swordplay before this trek is over, said Zelinda. Indeed we will, my lord, said Dowras. Now are we going to just sit here and talk or are we going to move along? What's this? Have your men halted while we spoke? Asked Zelinda. Dowras ignored him and wheeled his horse about. He barked to his men and ordered him to continue. The horns and trumpets sounded once again and the Einherjar resumed their march, their banners flying in the light breeze coming off the Myra and Asa remounted their ponies and watched this exchange from the middle of the gap. They couldn't help but share in the excitement that emanated off the Arthurians. They smiled at each other and urged their mounts to a walk. They clip-clopped their way out onto the desert. Wait up you two, called a voice. Myra looked over her shoulder and saw Jason trotting up to them. Behind him was Daniel, bouncing up and down on Box's back with each step. They caught up to them and reined in their steeds. Have you got everything you need? Jason asked. I think so, said Asa. I've got all my things with me right here, said Myra, gesturing to her saddlebags. Ah, I see you've forgotten something rather important, said Jason after glancing at both of the youngsters' saddles. And what's that? Asked Asa. Water bottles, laughed Jason, I don't see any. Myra suddenly felt her mouth go dry. She swallowed as she recalled how she and Asa had become lost in the desert shortly after their arrival in the endless sands. They had been lost for only a few hours, but the parching heat had left an impression on the young she-elf, one that she wouldn't forget any time soon. She cleared her throat and looked back towards the gap. She could see Mrs. Draconis and Beatrice standing next to the big pile of rocks. They were talking to Princess Lisa and Strath. The two women looked worried, glancing over at him every now and then. They must be telling him about the man in black, thought Myra. What do you think he wanted with us? Asa signaled to her. I don't know, Myra transmitted, maybe nothing at all. What does the book say about him? Asa asked aloud. About who? Inquired Jason. Myra ignored him and reached into her saddlebag. She withdrew an old book bound in green-colored leather with gold and silver inlay embedded in the front and back covers. The pages were yellowing parchment and Myra could feel the magic of the book tingling her fingertips as she held it. She opened it and watched as words began to magically write themselves across the blank pages. Both Myra and Asa read the script as fast as it appeared. The Arthurian race has at long last been freed from its exile. They go now to their rightful homeland, far away to the north, across the shifting dunes and the sundering sea. They will face many trials and hardships along the way, from enemies both new, hated and ancient. They will endure these adversities with their strong hearts and deep faith. They were promised by the Dragon Queen that they would see their homes again, and she and her husband have never lied to them. Go forth, Myra and Asa, go forth and follow them to Arthuria. Myra and Asa waited for several seconds for more words to appear, but nothing happened. The book was done telling them what it wanted to say, and nothing that the youths could do could persuade it otherwise. Myra closed the tome and put it back in her saddlebag. I wish it would be more direct with us, grumbled Asa. So do I, agreed Myra. She turned back towards the Einherjar and saw that the soldiers had moved on a considerable distance from them. Their brightly polished armor and weapons glinted in the sunlight. The shine from them was so bright that Myra had to raise her hand to shield her eyes. She could see the housecarls beyond the footmen, riding to and fro across the sands. The horsemen were now acting as scouts for the Einherjar as an apology for their earlier stunt. Myra could hear them calling to each other in their native language. All seemed well. The riders were laughing and joking amongst themselves, their horses whinnying and tossing their manes as they galloped. A few of the men began singing about old adventures they had had when they had been younger. Suddenly Myra heard a loud cry from one of the younger riders. It wasn't a cry of fear so much as it was one of shock and surprise. A thick swirl of dust had erupted directly below one of the riders. The horse bucked while the rider grabbed the reins with both hands and held on as the animal leapt backwards in fright. There was another cloud of dust further on, then another one, then another and another. A harsh-sounding horn was blown at that moment, and it was clear that it hadn't come from the Arthurians. The horses whinnied and the housecarls shouted in confusion as the swirls of sand settled and revealed what had caused them. Over a dozen men had materialized. All of them dressed in the traditional garb of nomadic slavers, black turbans and head scarves with billowing white robes and red sashes. The men had been hidden in the sand. They had buried themselves in shallow depressions, covering themselves with a thin layer of sand and laying as still as possible. They had done this when they had first seen the massive stone doors swinging open and realized that the Arthurians were coming out onto the sands. Their plan, if one could call their hastily concocted half-baked scheme a plan, had been to let the scouts pass over them and to jump out once the vanguard was too far away to impede them. Then they would rush into the gap, grab as many Arthurians as was possible and drag them off as slaves. The slavers had thought it was a good plan, and to their credit it just might have worked had there been more of them and fewer Arthurians. Their fortunes, however, had taken a different turn. One of the slavers had been stepped on by a horse and had been forced to act prematurely. When he moved, the others were left with no choice but to follow his example. They threw back their sand-covered cloaks, sending out a shower of dust that scared the horses of their enemies. The aptly named Children of the Sands sprang to their feet, drew out their curved scimitars, jambier daggers and flanged maces and lashed out at the nearest Arthurian, shrieking their undulating battle cries in their harsh desert tongue. The mounted housecarls were so shocked and amazed by their sudden appearance that they forgot their danger and for a few precious seconds gaped at the bearded and swarthy men in sheer disbelief. The slavers used these fleeting moments to close the gap between themselves and their long-hated foe. They attacked them with all the ferocity they could muster. 5 horsemen were grabbed by calloused, weather-beaten hands and pulled off their braying steeds. The riders were then thrown to the ground and brutally attacked. They were kicked, punched, clubbed, beaten and stabbed viciously. The slavers who had swords in their hands began hacking and slashing madly at the downed men, their curved blades sparking against the Arthurians' riveted mail. More horns were sounded, and from over the dunes came charging 500 men, some riding on horseback, others on camelback, but mostly on foot. These new arrivals were better armed than those who had buried themselves in the sands. They carried various kinds of shields made of either wood, wicker, animal skins or metal. Their weapons were long spears with jagged edges and horsehair tassels. Many of them were armed with recurved bows, while others carried flintlock muskets and pistols. The slavers that came over the ridge of dunes had gathered themselves together in a tightly packed formation. With a cry of fury they charged the Arthurians, their wayward slaves. The slavers were blasting their horns and screaming like madmen as they sprinted towards their hated enemies. This all took place in a matter of seconds, and the thoroughly stunned Arthurians were forced to admit that battle had been joined. "Where the hell did they come from?" cried Ling Tra. "Who cares? Let's have some fun," roared Kala as he gazed at the advancing foe and felt the joy of battle inflame his booming heart. "Charge!" shouted Zelinda, spurring Maya to a full gallop. "Arthuria!" howled Emmett as he thundered after Zelinda. The old battle cry of their people had roused the stunned housecarls to action, and they followed their chieftains into battle, drawing their swords and flashing them over their helmed heads. The cavalry of the Arthurians and that of the slavers crashed into each other, and a wild chase ensued. The slaver horsemen were lightly armed and armored in comparison to their Arthurian counterparts, but due to this fact they were slightly faster and more maneuverable than the immortal horse lords. They dashed in and out of the skirmish, slashing and hacking at their perennial enemy and then darting away before the Arthurians could retaliate. Ling Tra and his men, who were all skilled at mounted archery, were chasing one group of riders who were armed with bows. The hunters and hunted traded arrows with each other as they galloped over the sands. Emmett and his riders followed them for a little while until it became clear that their long lances could not reach the fleeing targets. The riders of the tribe of stags turned away and began chasing down and lancing the considerably slower camels and their riders. Emmett hated the humpbacked creatures with a passion. He made it a point of honor to slay as many of the stinking beasts as possible. Kala, meanwhile, had plunged headlong into the fight but had been knocked out of the saddle by a lucky blow to his chest and was now fighting on foot. He was howling with half-crazed laughter as he swung his great bearded axe in wide arcs before him, hewing down all those unlucky enough to get in his way. The slavers were utterly terrified of him. Nearby Zelinda and his mounted swordsmen threw themselves into the thickest parts of the fighting, hacking and slashing at their foes with mighty strokes of their keen blades. Fafnir sang as it sliced through the air, ringing as it connected with an enemy weapon. More often than not, the ancient Arthurian sword would shatter the foe's defense and then quickly end the life of Zelinda's opponent with a deft stroke to the heart. The Einherjar, meanwhile, had remained in formation, standing rank upon rank. They interlocked their metal shields and leveled their long spears towards their foes. The soldiers waited for their master's command to advance and to attack. They impatiently ground their teeth together as they watched their mounted comrades fighting with the enemy horsemen. They wanted to join in the fun as well, but they were highly disciplined and thoroughly trained, the best of the best. They knew that their captain was holding them back for a reason, and within a few minutes they saw it charging towards them. The slavers who were fighting on foot had gotten past the housecarls with their formation more or less intact. They were advancing towards the royal guard, their spears already leveled at them. Douras saw this and smiled in spite of himself. "The fools! They're going to try and stand toe to toe with us." He laughed aloud, bemused at the sheer audacity of his enemies. "We'll teach them why that's a bad idea," called one of his sergeants. "Einherjar!" cried Douras, his clear voice ringing out over the din of battle. He held his sword high over his winged helm, the blade flashing in the sunlight. "Istakam rouse!" All of the members of the Einherjar roared in unison as they braced themselves for what they foresaw would be a short but bloody fight. With another harsh horn blast, the Sand Children infantry smashed full speed into the waiting ranks of royal guardsmen. The impact was tremendous. The line of Arthurian warriors bent inwards but did not break. The children of the sands pressed on, screaming and babbling in their harsh tongue. Spears were thrusted with all their might. Swords hacked and slashed. Battle-axes chopped and hewed while warhammers pounded and smashed. The Einherjar withstood the savage blows, their steel shields, helmets and hauberks deflecting the wild strikes. The Sand Children slavers went blind with their fury and pressed their attack deeper and deeper, lusting to spill at least one drop of Arthurian blood. Finally Douras gave the signal and the Einherjar stopped yielding ground. They planted their booted feet into the sand and refused to budge. The slavers threw themselves at the heavily armored men, desperate for their blood. Many of the less well-equipped slavers had only wicker shields to defend themselves. They learned to their horror that the Einherjar spears had little difficulty in penetrating them. Some of the slavers threw down their now broken weapons and began grasping at the long spears, trying to pluck them out of the hands of their foes. Some of the sand children succeeded in wresting the spears away from the Einherjar, but the Arthurians simply drew out their famed swords, their Ulfberts. The true slaughter began in earnest. Men screamed as their hands and forearms were severed from their bodies. Others fell dead after having their skulls split by one mighty stroke. The slavers began to withdraw, but to their mounting horror they realized their mistake too late. They had pressed the attack far too much. The ranks of Einherjar had continued to bend inwards, and at a signal from Dauras they moved to surround them completely. The slavers realized this and tried desperately to break out of the ring, only to be met with death at every turn. The Einherjar were roaring with triumph as they continued to press their advantage. Soon the vast majority of their enemies was lying in bloodied heaps before them. The sand was slick with their spilt blood. Those slavers who fought on were either mad with terror or wild with bloodlust. One man, a high-born noble judging by his red silk coat and gem-studded belt, stood atop the piles of dead and swung his scimitar with both hands. His head covering was gone, revealing his curly black hair that was streaked with flecks of grey and silver. He had a badly bleeding gash above his right eye. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, determined to kill or maim at least one of his foes before his inevitable demise. When the Einherjar closed in around him, they did so slowly, cautiously. They could see the madness in his eyes, the kind that only condemned men felt when they saw no escape and were determined to fight on to the very end. The man swung his curved sword at him, causing the men to leap back. The Einherjar knew that desperate men like him were sometimes able to perform feats of near superhuman strength. The Arthurians decided that discretion was the better part of valor and chose to spear him at a safe distance. They thrusted their steel-tipped shafts at him, but to their surprise he was able to deflect them with his sword, cutting the heads off several spears in the process. "The curse of the Jinn be upon you," he howled in his desert language as he defended himself. The Einherjar, simultaneously surprised and impressed, growled back at him and continued their attack. The man kept defending himself with amazing skill as he screamed verbal abuse at them. "Damn you all to hell! You unnatural sons of she-camels! You misbegotten bastards! You spawn of serpents! May the gods wither your hands! May your sons die in the desert! May your daughters be ravaged by jackals! May your fathers be food for the vultures! May your mothers curse the day you were born! Prophets give me strength! Death to the infidel slaves! Death to Arthuria! Death to King Zelinda and Queen Lisa!" These were only a scant few of the insults that the man shrieked as he fought for his life. Many of the Einherjar could speak his language and understood his curses. This angered him, and they fought all the harder, determined to kill him if only to shut him up. The man, however, proved too skilled with his sword and forced them back single-handedly. For a single fleeting moment he believed that he was going to win. He saw the Einherjar, the best warriors among the Arthurians, give way to him and pull back. He was going to make it. He was going to cut his way out of the ring of death. He was going to survive. What the man didn't realize was that the Einherjar were pulling back to ensure that they wouldn't accidentally spear Captain Dauras by mistake. The master of the royal guard rode up behind the lone slaver, leapt from the saddle, pounced upon the sand child's back and forced him to the ground. Then, before the man could recover his scattered wits, Dauras smashed him in the back of his head with the pommel of his sword, knocking him unconscious. Several Einherjar lunged forwards with a cry, their swords and spears poised to kill, but their captain shot to his feet and stood over the downed man. "No," he roared at his advancing men, "we take this one alive." The Einherjar slid to a halt before their master. Their blood was up and they were eager to continue the killing, the joy of battle filling their hearts with fire. But their captain had spoken and his word was law. They lowered their weapons and bowed their helmed heads to Dauras to show respect. They would follow his command. "Reform!" cried an officer as a horn blew. The Einherjar rushed back into their original formation and faced out into the desert. They interlocked their shields and leveled their bloodied spears as they watched the slaver cavalry and the mounted housecarls chasing each other across the dune. When the Einherjar had been battling with the slaver infantry, they had failed to notice a single enemy horseman thunder past them. The rider rode upon a white horse and was clad all in white. His cloak billowed in the wind behind him as he galloped as fast as he could. He knew that the battle was already lost and that his friends and comrades were slated for death at the hands of their wayward slaves. But he was dead set upon stealing at least one Arthurian before he escaped into the desert. He could see the gap in the high stone cliffs, the damned cliffs that had shielded the damned Arthurians for so very long. He was the first of the children of the sands to ever see what lay within the sanctuary. What he saw filled his racing heart with both joy and horror. The stories were true. Beyond the high mountain walls lay a paradise of green grassy fields where millions of sheep, goats and horses could graze. The man knew that there must be rivers of pure clean water irrigating the land in order for so much grass to grow. His heart soared at the thought of claiming that rich country for himself and his people. When that had been achieved, there would be no need for his people to squabble over the finite resources of the endless sands. But then he saw the numberless hordes of Arthurians that were ready to swarm out of the gap. There must have been hundreds upon thousands of them, perhaps even millions of Arthurians. The man's heart sank with pure horror. How could the slaves have bred so many people? The horseman turned his galloping steed away from the gap and was about to forsake any notion of grabbing a new slave when he saw a group of 4 riders ahead of him. He saw that only one of the horsemen was armed and armored and that the rest, as far as he could tell, were defenseless. One of the riders was a girl with long bright red hair. "She'll fetch a good price with that fiery head of hers," he thought as he drew out his scimitar and uttered his battle cry. Myra and the others had stayed rooted to the spot when the battle had first started. They couldn't believe that it was actually happening. Myra and Asa watched with a mixture of awe and disgust as the Arthurians fought and killed the slavers. The youngsters had only seen one real battle, the Battle of Hovel's Well, since their arrival in the Endless Sands. That had been several days ago and had consisted of far fewer combatants. Suddenly they heard an undulating cry and the thunder of approaching hooves. Myra turned and saw the rider in white bearing down on them. The man's face was veiled and she could only see his harsh eyes that were glaring greedily at her. "He's coming after me," Myra thought as she pulled at the reins of her mount. Bayaz whinnied and reared, wheeling about on her hind legs. The little white pony bolted away as fast as her hooves would carry her. Asa spurred his coal-black steed to follow, but then something frightened his pony. The animal snorted and bucked Asa off, throwing him to the sands. Daniel looked over just in time to see the slaver bearing down on him, scimitar raised over his head. "What the?" he began but never finished. The man closed the distance between him and brought down his blade upon Daniel's head. The curved sword struck the gilded helmet, but fortunately for Daniel the magic that Thorold had imbued in it was still potent. The weapon shattered into 1,000 sparkling shards of splintered steel and sounded like breaking glass, only many, many times louder. The blow stunned Daniel and in a daze he fell from the saddle. Jason had seen the man coming at the same moment Myra had. He was pulling out his scoped rifle to deal with him, but he wasn't fast enough. He looked on in horror as his young cousin was struck over the head with a real sword. When the blade shattered, the sudden noise had caused Uhtred to rear up in fright, throwing Jason to the sand. Jason felt the wind being knocked out of him and he lay stunned. The slaver's horse also brayed in fear of the sudden noise and reared up, lashing out at the air with his front legs. The man was not thrown off the animal, however, and he managed to regain control over the beast. He cast his shattered sword aside and turned to follow Myra. The she-elf urged her filly on, but the slaver's horse was bigger and proved too quick for Bayaz to outrun. The man reached out and lunged for Myra, grabbing her by the back of her dress. Myra screamed as she was lifted from her saddle and thrown across the back of her pursuer's horse. The man spurred his steed on. He held Myra down with his right hand while he held the reins in his left. He smiled to himself as he galloped away, running parallel to the high cliffs. He was heading west, towards one of the oases that dotted the endless sands. There he would water his steed, properly secure his catch with thick leather cords around her wrists and ankles, and ride for one of the market towns. He would get a good price for her, if only for her red hair. There weren't that many Arthurians with red hair, and he knew the rarer something was, the higher the price would be. Jason groaned as he sat up. He looked to where Uhtred had been and saw that his horse had run off somewhere. "Damn you, horse!" he shouted angrily. He shot a quick look at Asa and Daniel and saw that both boys appeared more or less unharmed. Daniel was holding his helmeted head and complaining of a headache, while Asa was looking in the direction that Myra had gone. "Myra!" The word screamed through Jason's mind as he followed Asa's gaze. To his horror, he saw Bayaz running back towards them without her rider. Jason sprang to his feet and saw the man on the white horse galloping away as fast as he could. "Shit!" screamed Jason, his face turning pale. He caught something out of the corner of his eye and saw that in the confusion he had managed to pull out his rifle but had lost hold of it when he had fallen. Jason scooped it up and turned towards the fleeing rider. The man was several hundred yards away and he was moving quickly. It would be a difficult shot to make, and Jason knew that there was a chance that he might hit Myra by mistake. If that happened, he took several long deep breaths, forcing himself to calm down. His heartbeat slowed and the world went quiet around him. He was totally focused on the fleeing man. Die, thought Jason as he quickly chambered a round, brought the rifle up to his shoulder, took aim at the man's back and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot exploded in Jason's ears, shattering the stillness. Myra kicked and struggled with all her might, but she couldn't move. The man's hand was holding her in place in front of him. The horn of the saddle was boring into her stomach and both horse and rider stank terribly. Myra didn't want to be there. She didn't want to be a slave. She wanted to get away, as far away as she could. She wanted to go home. Myra screamed and thrashed, but it was no use. Her kidnapper was too strong for her. Suddenly the hand that held her down grew tense, gripping Myra so hard that it ripped the back of her dress. Then as quickly as his hold tightened, his fingers lost their strength and went limp. Myra could feel the change come over him, and she wasted no time in taking advantage. She threw herself off the galloping steed. She sailed through the air for a few seconds, flying parallel to the running white horse. Then she struck the sand, rolling for several feet before coming to a stop, dazed and bruised but otherwise unharmed. The slaver rode on for 100 more yards before he slipped off the saddle and fell lifeless to ground. The white horse whinnied and slowed its pace, confused at the sudden loss of its rider. It stopped and looked back, wondering why its master had fallen off. Myra lay breathless in the sand. She took several trembling gasps of air as she gazed up at the clear blue sky. She wanted to get up and run back to Jason and the others, but her body was too sore from the rough landing. Fortunately for her, she didn't need to run to Jason because he was sprinting over the sands to her. He flopped down next to her, his eyes wild and his breathing ragged. "Are you all right?" he cried. Myra gazed up at him, her body beginning to shake as her adrenaline returned to normal. She nodded and wrapped her arms around his middle. Jason enveloped her in his long strong arms and held her close, his body racked with tremors. They held one another for several long moments. Jason broke away from her and stood up, his face grim. "Stay here," he grunted. As he said this, Myra saw that he was holding his rifle in his hands. Her legal guardian turned towards the downed man and slowly began approaching him. "You had better be dead, you son of bitch," Jason growled as he chambered a new round and held his rifle at the ready. He walked slowly towards the man who lay face down on the sand. His brilliant white desert robes were stained red now, a bright rose having bloomed near the middle of his back. Good, thought Jason as he drew nearer. The white horse had trotted back to his master and now stood guard over him. It snorted and reared at Jason's approach, lashing out at him with its front hooves. "Beat it," shouted Jason, "go on. Get out of here, shoot." The horse brayed loudly and refused to budge. Jason fired a shot into the air and the white horse turned and bolted away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Jason scowled as he watched it go. He chambered another round and approached the lifeless man. He certainly looked dead, but Jason wanted to make sure. He stood over the body for a moment, examining the child of the sands. Jason hadn't met that many of their kind before, and each interaction had left a bad taste in his mouth. He sniffed the air, smelling the thick stench of sweat and spices wafting off the man. It was strong enough to wrinkle his nose. "Ugh," he gagged as he pinched his nostrils shut with his left hand. Jason decided against shooting the man again for two reasons. The first was because he wanted to conserve his ammunition. The second was because he was afraid that the slaver would smell worse on the inside. Jason drew back his booted foot and kicked the man in the ribs as hard as he could. The slaver did not make a sound or move. Dead. Good, Jason thought, a grim smile on his face. Anyone who dared to harm Myra in any way would be taking their lives into their hands as far as Jason was concerned. He secretly knew that this dead creature lying at his feet wouldn't be the last man he would kill on Myra's behalf. Jason slung his rifle over his shoulder and turned away. He began walking back to Myra. He could see that she hadn't gotten up off the sand yet. She was watching him as he came back to her. Her expression was hard to read at this distance, but if Jason had to make a guess, he would have said that he thought that she looked concerned. Myra was indeed troubled, but it wasn't just the fact that she had nearly been carried off to who knows where. She saw the dark look in Jason's eye when he had gone off to confirm his kill, and she had heard the tone in his voice. He's bloodthirsty, she thought as she watched him turning back to her. It was at that moment that the supposedly lifeless man sprang up. The slaver reached into his robes and pulled out his Jambia dagger. He turned and charged towards Jason, holding his knife over his turban-clad head. He screamed his battle cry as he lunged. "Jason!" shrieked Myra in horror. Jason spun around, his right hand going for his .45 caliber automatic pistol holstered at his side. His fingers fumbled as he grabbed hold of the weapon. Jason could see the man charging at him, and he knew that he was too close. He'd never be able to draw out his sidearm before the man drove the knife into him. Something flew past his face and he felt a blade slicing across his right cheekbone, directly below his eye. He flinched, feeling that blood had been drawn. He jumped back and raised his weapon at his assailant. What the hell? He thought in bewilderment when he saw what was in front of him. The slaver had dropped his knife. His hands were clutching at an arrow that was sticking out his throat. The man was gagging on his own blood, choking to death on the very substance that had kept him alive. He made a horrible gasping gargling sound as he tried desperately to pull out the barbed shaft. The more he pulled at it, the more blood poured out. His once brilliant white robes were now turning a dark red as arterial blood gushed from his severed jugular. He dropped to his knees, coughing and gasping. Jason felt sick to his stomach as he watched and listened to the morbid sight in front of him. He tightened his grip on his weapon and fired his handgun at the dying man. He shot all 8 rounds into the slaver's chest, head and face, firing as fast as the weapon's mechanism would allow. The slaver flopped backwards, a pool of blood darkening the sand around him. This time Jason was certain that he was dead. He bellowed a curse at him before turning back to face Myra. Myra had watched in horror and disgust at the slaver's final moments. She thought it was a horrible way for anyone to die. She closed her eyes and looked away. The sound of approaching hooves filled her pointed ears. Myra opened her eyes and glanced back over her shoulder. She saw Zelinda and Ling Tra riding up to her. Both chieftains slid to a halt and leapt off their steeds. Myra could see that they were covered in dust and specks of blood. "Are you all right?" cried Zelinda. Myra was still shaken and it took her a second to reply. "Why yes, I'm fine," she answered, her voice trembling. "Thanks for the save, Ling Tra, but you cut it kind of close there, didn't you?" shouted Jason as he trotted up to them. "What are you talking about, Master Argonaut?" asked Ling Tra. "This," growled Jason, pointing at the cut under his right eye. "When you shot that guy you damn near hit me instead," he continued, "2 heads, 1 arrow." "I didn't shoot that man," said Ling Tra. "Isn't this your arrow?" asked Jason, holding up the bloodied missile for him to see. Myra felt sick to her stomach as she looked at the arrow. She looked away and gagged. She closed her eyes and covered her pointed ears and tried desperately to forget what she had just seen. Ling Tra quickly plucked it out of Jason's hands and examined it closely. "This didn't come from me," he said. "I didn't have any shots left when Zelinda and I saw what was happening here. Anyway, this isn't like one of mine. My men and I use arrows with white fletching and black shafts. This one has black fletching and a white shaft. The complete opposite," noted Jason. "Indeed," said Zelinda as he took the arrow from Ling Tra and turned it over in his hands. "The head is all wrong too," he continued. "Don't you and your people use broad heads instead of bodkins when you're fighting?" "Yes we do," replied Ling Tra. "This arrow didn't come from me." "Then where did it come from?" asked Jason. "I have no idea," answered Ling Tra. "Well, whoever shot him put him down for good this time," said Jason. "I could have sworn he was dead when I turned my back on him." "Did he smell at all?" asked Ling Tra. "A really nasty pungent smell that stings your nose." Jason nodded. "In that case he must have just taken a dose of something his people call fireroot," said Ling Tra. "What's that?" asked Jason. "It's a plant that they take to dull their pain and to heighten their aggression," Ling Tra explained. "They dry it out, then they either eat it, smoke it or snort it up their noses. Most of the nomads groups out on the dunes use it. And it's a good thing that they do," said Zelinda. "When they take it we can smell them coming a mile off." "So you're saying that when I shot this guy he didn't feel it?" asked Jason. "Oh, he most certainly felt it," said Ling Tra. "But when you suffer a wound when you've taken fireroot your body will shut down for a few minutes. Then you wake up feeling as though you could take on the whole world single-handedly," said Zelinda. "You saw how he jumped up like nothing had happened to him," said Ling Tra. "He was in a flurry of berserk rage. He couldn't feel anything but aggression. We've seen whole companies of theirs throw themselves at us after taking one dose too many, said Zelinda. Sounds like a great way to get yourself killed, said Jason as he glanced over at the slaver's body. Indeed, said Zelinda, now I suggest that we stop talking and head back to the others. No need, said Ling Tra as he gazed back the way he and Zelinda had come. Look, Emmett and Carla are heading this way. So they are, laughed Zelinda as he followed Ling Tra's gaze and saw the two other chieftains approaching them. Emmett trotted up to them riding his blonde horse, Blank, and leading Uhtred by the reins. The chieftain of the tribe of Stages had managed to catch Jason's wayward steed after a short pursuit. The chestnut-brown horse champed at the bit and tossed his mane as he drew closer to his master, who was not happy to see him. Uhtred, if you ever throw me like that again, I'll lead you into the glue factory myself, growled Jason. Forgive him, Master Argonaut, said Emmett as he tossed him the reins. He's young and high-strung like all stallions at his age. He didn't mean to betray you. Yeah, well, he could have fooled me, said Jason. Carla, meanwhile, jogged up to them. The big Arthurian was covered in sweat, specks of blood and dust, and he still carried his long-hefted bearded axe in both hands. He growled and panted like a bear as he trudged through the loose sand towards them. He hadn't been able to catch his horse after being knocked out of the saddle during the fighting. Ha, getting a little exercise, big brother, laughed Ling Tra. Oh, shut up, huffed Carla as he slowed to a stop beside Emmett. Once he halted, he stood leaning on his axe for a long while, panting and sweating. He unhooked his canteen from his belt and began eagerly sucking out the contents of it. My lords, we seem to have a mystery on our hands, said Zelinda. What mystery? Asked Carla, pausing his guzzling only long enough to speak. Master Argonaut's life was just saved by this arrow that I hold in my hand, said Zelinda, holding the bloodied shaft for the newcomers to see. He was nearly hit by it himself, as you can see by the cut under his eye. Ling Tra claims that the shot isn't his and that the arrow is unlike the ones he and his people use. It is clear to me that the wolf is telling the truth. Now the question is this. If Ling Tra didn't shoot this arrow, then who did? Don't look at me, said Carla. Do you see any arrows or a longbow on me? Besides, neither my men nor I can shoot worth a damn. You've known me long enough to know that I'm telling the truth. You're right, Carla, said Ling Tra. It couldn't possibly have been you who loosed this arrow. Besides, you couldn't hit a mountain from 3 paces away. Carla looked at Ling Tra, undecided whether he should be insulted or not. And your men are famed for their skills in axe fighting, not shooting, said Zelinda. What about you, Emmett? What do you have to say about this? The shot didn't come from me either, said the chieftain of the tribe of Stags. I don't have my bow with me, and all my housegirls are armed with swords and lances. A few of them have javelins, but they are all too far from here to hit anything. No, the arrow didn't come from my men. And all my men have only swords, said Zelinda. If none of you guys shot him, then who did? Cried Jason. Does it matter? Said Myra. All 5 men looked over to her as she rose to her feet and faced them. Whoever did it saved your life, she said to Jason. That's all I care about. Yes, that's true, said Jason. I'd just like to know who I owe my life to is all. We'll figure this out later, said Zelinda. A horn sounded as he spoke. Myra and the others turned to see men charging out of the gap in the wall. Some were on foot while most were on horseback. All of them were wearing bright purple, signifying that they belonged to the tribe of Owls. At the head of the new mounted company was Lord Tywin, chieftain of the tribe of Owls. He was riding a blood bay horse. His purple cloak was billowing behind him as he charged into the battle. His langsau flashed in the sunlight as he plunged into the fray. Close behind the purple-clad men came warriors and riders dressed in brown, grey, white and a combination of all the tribal colors. The new combatants were members of the tribe of Boars, Hares, Doves and the Seers respectively. The few remaining slavers who still fought on saw them coming, but their determination to fight on to the end only deepened. They hated their wayward slaves and wanted to make them suffer before the end came for them. The slavers uttered their battle cries and held their curved swords over their turban-clad heads in defiance. But then they saw something else charging out of the gap in the wall. The sight that met their eyes bewildered and horrified them to their cause. The men of the desert had heard stories of such monsters when they had been younger, but they had never truly believed them. What god in its right mind would create such hellish creatures as these two? The children of the sands gaped in disbelief as Amaron and Twizel charged bellowing out onto the desert. The two dragons had watched the battle from within the sanctuary and had held themselves back. The Arthurians had appeared to be enjoying themselves, and the two dragons hadn't wanted to spoil their fun. But now only the die-hard fanatics were left, and their resolve needed to be broken quickly. Amaron ran towards the nearest group of slavers and uttered such a ferocious roar that the men either dropped their weapons or fainted from pure fright. Twizel opened her wings to their full span and leapt into the air. She circled over the battlefield and picked out her targets. She swooped down, plucked up two of the more fanatical fighters in her foreclaws and carried them high into the air. When they reached an altitude of 500 feet, she leveled out and looked down at her two prisoners. "Do you surrender?" she asked them in their own language. Both men were too terrified to answer and merely gawked up at her in utter bewilderment. Twizel smiled and chuckled to herself as she saw both of them dropping their swords. The weapons plummeted to the desert below. It was indeed fortunate for the two slavers that it had been Twizel who had grabbed them. Any other dragon would have simply ripped him to pieces or let them fall to their deaths. Twizel, however, saw no need for this and began to descend. Amaron, meanwhile, was less kind than his sister. He was still angry from his altercation with Arngir and took the opportunity to vent his wrath upon the slavers. The swarthy men screamed in horror as the great grey dragon bore down on him, fire leaping from his cavernous maw with each roar. Amaron roasted 5 of them and then stomped another 3, crushing them like ants. He backhanded 2 more, sending them flying, and then swatted away another slaver with his barbed tail. Suddenly there was a loud bang and Amaron felt something sting him in his left thigh. He turned his huge bulk around to see that another man had fired his flintlock camel gun at him. Amaron wasted no time in dispatching him. The dragon lunged forward and chomped the slaver in his jaws. Then Amaron shook the dead man in his mouth, like a terrier shaking a rat. He could feel the flesh ripping between his large teeth and could taste blood and bile pouring onto his tongue. Amaron hated the taste of man flesh. It was so vile that it nearly made him gag with disgust. Finally he opened his jaws and tossed the shredded body away, roaring as he did. He breathed a gout of flame to cleanse the taste from his mouth and shook his horned head, snapping his jaws shut. He snorted and was about to turn away when he caught sight of another child of the sands. Amaron turned to destroy him but stopped short when he realized that the slaver was only a boy. Amaron towered over the trembling little form and studied him. He reasoned that the child couldn't have been any older than 14 years old. Amaron lowered himself down to look the boy in the eye. Their gaze met and the dragon immediately put him under his spell. "I don't want to hurt you, boy," he said in the language of the desert tribes. "My kind do not make war on children. I spare you only because you are not yet a man. Remember my mercy. Go back to your people and tell them what you saw here. Tell them that Amaron, son of Amaroth, has given him this one and only warning to stay away. Now go." Amaron broke the spell and stood up to his full height. The boy doubled over and vomited the moment the magical connection was severed. He retched for several seconds and gasped to get his breath back. Amaron stood over him and watched. He knew that this was always the reaction most people had whenever they were put under dragon spell. After several seconds the boy staggered to his feet and turned away. He bounded over the dunes as fast as he could, desperate to get away from the giant scaly monster that had murdered all his comrades. Amaron snorted as he watched the boy disappear over a dune. He shook himself and turned back towards the wall, just in time to see his sister landing nearby. The dragoness released her 2 prisoners into the custody of the Einherjar and walked over to her brother. "Was that really necessary?" she asked as she glanced the brutally shattered bodies of Amaron's victims. Her brother only grunted and snorted a jet of steam at her through his nostrils. Twizel growled at him and bared her teeth. Meanwhile the battle was coming to an end. The few surviving slavers saw that their situation was hopeless and being left with no other choice surrendered. They threw down their weapons and flags and fell upon their knees, begging their foes for mercy. Fortunately for them the Arthurians had had their fill of killing for the day. They gathered up all the slavers into one group and surrounded them with a company of Einherjar. Then the Arthurians began to cheer in celebration of their victory. They blew their horns and howled up at the clear sky, roaring in triumph over their enemies. The children of the sands bowed their heads in shame and covered their faces. The battle was over and the Arthurians had won.